meeting here. So thank you everyone for joining. I'll give you a little brief background information on Intertek, who we are, and then introduce myself as well. So a little bit about Intertek. We focus primarily on product safety and compliance. So think of any consumer products that go out into the market. Whenever you purchase those products, you are assuming that that product is not going to cause any type of harm or risk. So the that's kind of what we do, is make sure and ensure that that product isn't going to harm you as a user or consumer, and pose any type of risk or hazard. And we've got several different departments or business units that focus on different areas or type of products. So we here within our Plano lab, we do have a hazardous location, a EMC that focuses on electro. Um, Oh man, I just forgot the terminology. We focus on EMC, which is emissions and immunity. We also have our household appliance and electronics team. We have HVAC, performance, safety, and gas. And then we have ICT, which is information communication technology, which I am the team lead for, and then medical, which focuses on our medical product, which I'm sure you are more interested in about than the other groups. But that's just kind of a brief summary of who Intertech is and kind of what we do. Let's see. Okay, so just a little bit about myself. I actually graduated from the University of Texas at Dallas with a Bachelor's of Science in Biomedical Engineering. So I am an alumni, and kind of how I reached back out to Dr. Porter and the organization. I started off my career soon after graduating within as a consulting in the healthcare, construction, and design sector, and was focusing on outfitting different hospitals, clinics within the private and government sector. And then I transitioned over to a product safety engineer here within Intertek. I started off with our household appliance and electronics division, and then transitioned and was promoted to a team lead, and then transitioned over to our team lead for our medical and ICT groups. All right, so a little bit about our company. The topic that I'll be focusing on is identifying the differences between recognized components and listed products. So this is one item that is critical and is important within our industry in order to address and make sure that we are evaluating the product that does come through our labs, and making sure that they comply and are in line within the standard requirements for different countries and regulations that are required in order for that product to be sold within that certain country, or within that category. So I'll provide a brief introduction, then we'll kind of talk about the critical care abouts for recognized components, and kind of what that entails. Focus on something that is known as conditions of acceptability, and why we care about those. And then we'll talk about a brief explanation of what listed products are, and then we'll conclude and open up the floor for any Q&As. Okay. So for an introduction, in terms of recognized components versus listed products, so think of any type of electronic um, product that you can see out in the market or that you would encounter. All of those are composed of different components. So that can be from as small as a resistor, capacitor, to maybe something a little bit more large, that could be maybe a power supply that it within itself has its own components, to maybe an overall enclosure. So thinking of all of those, just keep that in mind as we kind of go through this presentation. The other item that we'll be focusing on is the conditions of acceptability, which is one of your key differentiators between recognized components and listed products. And then we'll also briefly touch on the impact that it has on overall end product safety and kind of what that means. And then the other differentiator between recognized components and listed products is something that you'll see is a mark of conformity uh, marking. that will have a differentiation between recognitions versus listing for components and products that are provided by third-party certification. So Intertek would be a third-party certification authority, but there are other competitors. The other one that is very common and widely known is UL for Underwriters Laboratory. You also have CSA, which is Canada um, laboratory, and then you have others like Nemco, and there's a few others European, but your most common, I believe, is ETL, which is what Intertek is, and then UL and CSA for North America at least. Um, All right, so in terms of your critical care balance for recognized components, so again, kind of going back to thinking of all of your different components that make up a product or that are involved to compose that product, you're thinking about that individual component that is an incomplete construction, which requires further evaluation. So, for example, if we're looking at a capacitor, for instance, its application can be quite um, diverse in how it is used. Maybe you're using it in a medical product. Maybe you're using it in a toaster or a refrigerator of some sort. So its applications vary, and then it can be used as different types of applications. So the complete construction of maybe that component may not be complete. So you would have to take into consideration that end product use. So because of that incomplete construction and all of those different applications that may affect how it is evaluated, that makes it a recognized component, for example, for discussion purposes. And those limitations in terms of what cannot be completely evaluated at that component level are documented as conditions of acceptability. So, and then some other international safety reports or other laboratories may have a different terminology, such as application considerations. And so, one of the critical um, things that we were wanting to take into consideration and look at is those conditions of acceptability, because depending on how that component is used within an end product, then you want to make sure that that is not being overlooked in terms of what those conditions may be, which we'll kind of talk about in the next slide. And then here below, I kind of included some of those markings that you can see or come across. So in the bottom left corner there, we've got the CSA logo marking that you will kind of come across for recognized components. So that triangle there indicates that the recognition or the marking label that it would receive is for a recognized component. Versus if it didn't have that, it would be for a listed product. And then the C and the US would represent the evaluation it was for. So in this case, it was for to the Canadian and US standards requirements. So this, if that component met all of those requirements per the standards outlined by the Canadian and US standards, then it would receive this type of marking. For Intertek, which we have an ETO logo, that's our brand, it would receive the one that's in the middle, and it would have a documentation where it would state that this would be for a recognized component. So again, that C in the US would indicate that this is for, it met the Canadian and US requirements in order to achieve that recognized component marking. And then another competitor we have is Underwriters Laboratories, which is UL, and they actually use a U and an R that is written backwards. And then again, the C in the US will kind of indicate the country standards that it received or that it met those requirements for. So these are some examples. Again, there are other national recognized testing laboratories that can also provide some of this type of marking and certification. It just kind of depends on what testing laboratory a certain manufacturer or applicant decided to go with. But these are just some examples. Any questions? Right? Great. The other critical differentiation in terms of considering for recognized components is the type of compliance that needs to be verified. So anytime we get a certain type of product and we're evaluating it, there are certain standards that we know that need to be applied to that particular product. And so based off of the product, when you're looking at any of the components that you're identifying as critical for safety purposes or for functionality, um, you're taking a look at what type of markings those components that you've identified as critical should have based off of either standard requirements or based off of given information in term that you're trying to verify. So as compliance engineers, that's something that is our job or responsibility is to verify that information. So if you are looking for a component and it is a recognition, then you're trying to look for certain information versus if you've got a listed product. So in terms of some examples, um, for example, if you are looking at a power supply, there's multiple types of power supply that you can encounter in products. One example I can give you is for your computers. So think of a power supply that goes inside of your laptop computers. That type of power supply may be exposed, so it's not a completely designed so that there's an enclosure that houses all of the components that make up that power supply. So maybe some of the rectifiers or transformers, maybe MOVs or varistors that make up the power supply are accessible if you were to open up your laptop computer versus a different type of power supply, which may be like the adapter that connects to your power supply. So then that power supply in itself has those components as well, but you have an enclosure that is protecting it and maybe some other items there that prevent you from accessing any of those components that potentially could have a high current or high voltage that could cause a risk of shock. Maybe if there's maybe proper distance that is separating those components from potentially arcing, that could potentially lead to a fire, or if you are using that charger for a long duration of time, if it was to heat up, that enclosure is protecting from accessing any of those hotspots, which could potentially lead it to a risk of heat in terms of touching it that could lead to a burn. Same thing for your computer. If you were to use that type of power supply in an open environment versus keeping it housed within the laptop, then you have that risk of potentially maybe shock or maybe some mechanical hazards depending on how that power supply inside was being handled. So identifying and knowing the proper type of component you have and the type of certification it should receive becomes critical to making sure that you're taking into account and considering all of these different parameters to make sure that we are providing a safe product and or evaluating all of these potential risks um, in that end product. So the lack of knowledge of these conditions of acceptability and recognized components could potentially compromise the overall safety. So kind of given some of that scenario within that power supply, um, thinking in terms of like the temperature requirements there or the enclosure that's providing maybe some type of mechanical protection are some of the things that you're kind of looking for within the end product. So if you get a recognized component, going back to the scenario within a power supply inside of a laptop, if that was maybe that power supply had a certain temperature range that it could safely operate in, say that was going to be installed maybe in a medical device that was going to be used in maybe high temperatures, but that power supply, it can only operate maybe at low temperatures. So if that power supply was to overheat, then you've got maybe some concerns for risk of fire or it overheating, as an example. Or maybe if that were power supply is only intended to be installed in a type of application where it has to be mounted, but maybe it's not being mounted um, in a certain orientation of some sort that could potentially cause some type of risk, then all of these conditions of acceptability, which would be noted, um, would be overlooked, or if somebody didn't know about them, that could potentially compromise the overall safety within that end product because they're not being taken into account or consideration. Any questions? Right. Great. So moving on to listed products. So listed product is more of a complete construction and evaluation within an overall device of some sort or product, for lack of better terms here. So again, kind of going back to your recognized components, that would be an incomplete construction versus a listed product. You have a complete construction, evaluation, and testing where you've considered all of your possible scenarios where there could be a potential risk. And you've addressed all of those based off of either standard requirements on the design and construction of the product or through some testing where you've kind of shown that if there was to be some type of fault condition or under normal operation, it's not going to lead to a potential hazard or it's going to fail safely. And within a listed product, you could have multiple safety components within that product that is going to be listed. It doesn't necessarily have to be one item. So taking into consideration the human body. So as an analogy, you can think of the each organ as a critical component that make up this listed product. So, for example, just limiting in terms of the function of the heart. So the heart has its own function and its own use, and it's limited within certain parameters. So you can think of it kind of like a recognized component that it can't do the function of the lungs or of the stomach or the brain. So in this scenario, that that component has a certain limitations and it's also critical in order for that overall product to do its functionality. Um, so thinking kind of in that terms or that scenario, um, that's kind of how you can, I guess, compare it to recognized components versus listed products. And then there, in some instances, you can have interchangeability. So if you think of um, heart plant or transplants, where maybe you have a different heart. Same thing or similar scenario applies, but then you are also having to look at compatibility. So that's another kind of example in terms of this analogy here. Um, and then here on the bottom left page, I provided some more markings that provides a just kind of for to view of kind of the different markings that you would see for listed products. So again, one of our other competitors such as UL or CSA, that's kind of how you would find markings on the products. So if it is listed, you would have that listed notation in the logo, and then the UL in itself would indicate that it is more than likely a listed product, and then the C and the U and US indicate the country that it received certification for. So whether that was for Canada, US, or if it only has for Canada, then it would have the C, or if it is US only, it more than likely won't have anything or it could just include the US. And then for Canada, um, they have their logo there in the bottom row. And then for Intertek, again, you will see our ETL logo, and it will indicate that it is listed. And then depending on if it met the Canadian and US requirements and standards, then it would have the CUS indicated or noted within the logo mark there. All right. So, in conclusion, the differences between recognized components and listed products is pretty much the conditions of acceptability that have to be verified. So your listed products will not have any conditions of acceptability, as it is something that you would have a complete construction and testing that would have been done versus a recognized component. You have some limitations that unfortunately can't be evaluated because it will depend on the end product application. So then you would have to notate those as conditions of acceptability, which would then have to be further evaluated and considered in that end product application. So going back to that example of the power supply, so when the laptop gets evaluated for compliance and certification, they would have to take into consideration some of the uses for that power supply versus the adapter. Once that gets evaluated and listed, there's nothing further that needs to be evaluated there except for the ratings in terms of what it can be used in. So you're not going to be able to use if that power supply was rated for 120 volts, but maybe you've got a product that is rated for 240 volts. Then that's something that you're taking into consideration, but you don't have to go into detail and looking at all of your components versus just looking at your electrical ratings and parameters for that listed product versus a recognized component. You're having to look at and consider all of those conditions of acceptability that were noted from that evaluation and certification. So listed product, kind of already explained that there. For compliance, it's just verified in the end product application. So you're looking at a more high level versus recognized component. You're taking a look at some more detailed conditions. And then without proper or effective understanding of these recognized components or listed product with tend to be pretty common amongst newer compliance engineers as they are kind of learning some of these terminologies and different parameters that are to be considered within the certification process, as it's not something that you kind of learn in school, can sometimes compromise or would be something that would compromise the overall safety of a product if that proper understanding isn't known, because again, those conditions of acceptability could potentially be overlooked based off of not knowing that that's something that is needs to be verified or considered during evaluation and testing to making sure that those parameters are met or are being used within applicable parameters that the product or components may have. That kind of just summarizes the presentation that I had prepared. I know kind of went a little quickly through it, but are there any questions or anything in terms of whether the presentation, I know it could maybe was a little technical in terms of, or specific in terms of what we do, but any questions on the presentation or Intertek as a whole?
So we have a question from Tyler. Do you use any adverse event trackers to aid with the total quality assurance done at Intertek for medical devices?
In terms of tracking the quality, we do have a plate in place where anything that is assigned to a compliance engineer, it's got to go through technical review. So this whole process, there are different phases in place that tracks making sure that those technical aspects aren't missed or overlooked. And then in addition, as compliance engineers, we have, um, I guess, like TPQs, but that's more of a qualification in terms of quality of manufacturing the product. There's not necessarily those parameters per se. That's more of on the manufacturing side, not necessarily for us. Not sure if that really answered your question.
Tyler, did that answer, or do you want to add anything to it?
No, that was great. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Any other questions?
Well, I have one if people are typing or anything like that, so I can go ahead and ask it
Sure.
there. How would somebody who's interested in joining into this line of work, what would be the best way for them to go about doing that? What kind of experience would they need to build now? And then how do they find their way in?
Sure. That's a great question. So we'll definitely be opening up a internship for the summer, where that will allow some exposure for testing. I think in my experience working here at Intertek, having some of that exposure for the testing that we perform kind of helps understand where some of the requirements from the standard come from. And then also just understanding or having a good foundation of your electronic or schematics of your very basics, so like kind of like ohm saw will definitely help, because a lot of the product that comes through are electrical. So just having that understanding, and then um, just wanting to learn. You're constantly learning in every project, and nothing is ever the same, even if it may be a similar product or a same type of category. That's You're always kind of learning something new. So I think just having a good foundation in your electronic side of components or schematics, like analysis, and then critical thinking, problem solving skills. And then in terms of testing, I think those are kind of the main key things that will kind of help prepare somebody for this role. A lot of it's kind of on the job and as you get more exposure. So we definitely provide training to kind of help bring um, our engineers up to speed and get the exposure that they need. Um, but yes, those are, I think, some of the things. Did I miss anything?
Well, I apologize if you already said it, but when would the internship be coming online?
Um, Probably closer to the summer. So looking at, I believe April, May timeframe for posting it.
Okay. We'll keep an eye out for that for sure. Other questions? Free to raise your hand or type it in the chat, or go ahead and just turn your mic on.
Yeah, I just had one more question.
Mhm.
What is like a daily what does the day in the life look like for a newly hired engineer at Intertek? Like, are you going to be working with teams, working with other people? Just yeah, like what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it kind of just depends. As a new engineer, you'll pretty much be doing training for the most part, for like maybe the first couple of weeks to a month. And then you'll be partnered with a more senior staff engineer, where you'll get exposure to either some of the testing and the different projects that may be happening at the time, or you may be kind of shadowing them in terms of the documentation that they're working on for the certification reports. And so it kind of is 50-50, and it just depends on the projects that are going on at the time. So on most part, it probably average out to like 50% documentation in terms of preparing certification reports or test plans, and evaluating, going through a construction review on the design of that product, and evaluating all of your potential risks and hazards. And then the other 50% is you're going in the lab and you're running those tests to verify that the product meets those requirements outlined per the standards.
Awesome. Thank you. That sounds really cool.
Yep.
That sounds neat that you get the hands-on in there too. Yeah.
Right.
So how
Yep.
often do you get to interact with other people? Or is this kind of a loner
Oh,
job,
sorry.
or are you on a
No, yes,
team?
you are constantly interacting with others, as you're asking questions or running tests. If it's especially if it's the first time or it's maybe not a very common test that is run, there's other people that you kind of communicate with. In terms of equipment that we use, we're a shared lab, so sometimes you'll interact with other teams, especially if they're using certain equipment, or if maybe you don't know how to operate something. So it's definitely very collaborative environment.
Cool. So you get paid to break things.
Yes.
That's awesome. Okay. Other questions? Tyler, I think I cut you off there. I'm sorry about that. Other questions? You can either turn your mic on or type it in the chat there.
And I think on the last slide, yeah, I've got my contact information. And then we are hiring. So if any of you are looking for a full-time job, if you are graduating in the spring, we definitely have some open positions available now if you would be interested in applying. And then we'll be opening up some more later on throughout the year.
Okay. I do see a question from Neha. Go ahead, Neha.
Thank you. I wanted to ask if if we were to be taking any classes during the internship, would there be any flexibility regarding that? So, like, could we schedule around those?
We probably have to coordinate with our HR. I believe for internship, I want to say maybe there's like a 20-hour per week. So if that's something that you are able to commit to, I'm sure we can work something out with your schedule.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mhm.
Awesome. I'm not sure if I grabbed the right thing, but I grabbed the Intertek engineering page off the career site and posted that in the chat for anyone. I think you can
Awesome. Thank
probably
you.
back into that is okay. So Lyric is asking, can you explain the difference between a PM versus an EP with your company? Which one is more valued or required or wanted as far as certifications go?
I'm actually not familiar with those terms. Would that be project manager and
She's typing. Yes.
project manager and
What
would
is an
that be
EP?
engineering project engineer maybe? Those are I'm not sure project manager. That may be a different category. Oh, engineering professional. Um, so I don't think that either or is um, wanted or required. Both of them are definitely great qualifications to have as you are managing multiple projects within a month. So the manager skills are definitely beneficial for the position. In terms of engineering professional, it definitely adds value for you as a employee and within your technical qualifications, but you aren't required, um, I guess, having an engineering license. We do have several employees who do have their engineering license that do certain projects um, that would require that, but it's not a requirement. It's definitely a plus to have. And it probably would depend on the type of projects that you'd like to work on, if that's something that would be a requirement.
Okay. Right. Awesome. Other questions then? I'm realizing looking out at the career site that there's probably a lot more options, so I'm just going to put the general one in here, not just the
Mhm.
specific engineer one. Sorry about that. This includes the
No problem.
technicians and the quality and everything else.
Yes, so we definitely get a lot of opportunities in different um, areas within our business units. So definitely take a look if anything interests you. Go ahead and apply. Um, and then we also are a global company, so we don't just have offices here in Plano. But if it's something that you'd be interested in applying, we've got positions here within our Plano office, and then we've got a couple of different all over the United States as well as over the country, other countries.
Very cool. Yeah. Any other questions then? All right. Well, thank you very much. We'll keep an eye out for that internship position, and we'll be sure that we share this with everyone else. We'll hopefully send you some really good candidates here. So thank you for coming and joining us.
Yep, awesome. Thank you for having me. And again, I apologize for being late here. But hopefully you guys enjoyed the presentation and definitely apply or reach out if you have any questions.
Absolutely. We appreciate it. Thank you very much. All
All
right.
right. Thank you.
Everybody else, enjoy the rest of your Monday.